Hi, I'm Vikki Reynolds. I'm here with Munro talking about feminism, narrative therapy, and your orientation to that. Can you just start by saying why you invited me to be in this conversation with you?
Sure. I guess first, thanks to Cheryl for inviting me to
Yeah.
participate in this. And I thought it'd be interesting to have you join me because I usually have really interesting conversations with you.
Yeah.
And you're a bit of a mentor for me and introduced me to narrative therapy.
Yeah, and we were talking too about most of the folks who are doing videos in this project identify as women, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not how you identify.
No, and I think that was one of the interesting things for me when we started talking about filming this conversation was I think throughout, if I look back through my history, mm-hmm. My relationship with feminism has gone through a lot of different peaks and valleys, if you would.
Yeah.
When I think about I'm 41 now, so when I think about growing up in suburban BC, British Columbia in Canada, yeah. It wasn't very cool to be a feminist. Yeah. It was pretty unsafe. Often if you were a feminist, you were actually thought to be a lesbian. So that was the last thing you wanted to identify with when you were a Catholic schoolgirl, which I was. So at that time, I had no interest for it. It seemed a leap to me. And it didn't seem, even though in some ways you might argue that was the time in my life that maybe it would have protected me the most. Right. It was so far from my reality that there was no way I would have identified with it.
Yeah. What shifted for you to start to see some place or some belonging in feminism for you?
Yeah, I think interestingly enough, I think even when I got older and went through a phase where I was I never identified as a lesbian, but I began to sort of identify as queer. And date women. And at that point in my life, I still didn't really identify with it. It felt like, it felt almost kind of old school for me. It didn't feel like it didn't have the intersectionality, or my analysis of it didn't have the intersectionality that I wanted to identify with it at that point either. And I think right around that time is when a lot more people started transitioning. I didn't meet a trans guy until I was in my mid-20s. I actually thought that was something, at the time they were using the word hermaphrodite, and I thought it was like a fabled thing. I didn't think it was actually something that you could do. Right. Until I moved to San Francisco and began to meet people who had transitioned. And I was just like, oh, this makes some sense. This is something it's not so strange. This is something that people do experience. And so I think it was actually my transition that I began to have more interest in not just ideas of feminism, but ideas about culture and race and class. And right around that time is when the U.S. Attacked Iraq, and I became interested in protests and activism, and began thinking of myself as really queer, not just attracted to a different sex or many different sexes or many different genders, but actually queer. So I think that when I understood feminism to be a piece of a puzzle rather than the puzzle, then all of a sudden it made a lot more sense to me. So I guess oddly, at the end of it, I'm more of a feminist as a male-identified person as I ever was as a female-identified person.
And that's kind of interesting, isn't it? And what difference does feminism make in your practice or in your life?
I think it makes a lot, and I think that, I was really lucky to transition to the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is one of the poorest postal codes in North America, for those of you who aren't Canadian. Has a lot of struggles. There's a lot of people dealing with poverty and racism and colonization, and then the ways that shows up and the symptoms, right, in terms of what gets called addiction and mental illness and all those things, and homelessness. And so I think in my transition, I was mirrored about how privileged I was. As a white person, as a settler in this land, as someone who was able to do my transition because doctors saw me stable enough to do it, which was a thing at that time.
Yeah.
So, and then at the same time, I was in a community where women were being disappeared, so feminism became more important to me for that reason too.
Yeah.
So I almost feel like throughout my transition I became radicalized, but I was also watching at that time a lot of young trans men come out, and feminism not have space for them. And a lot of trans women having women's groups use feminism as a tool to not include them. So it was a complicated time that I think we've really figured some things out. And I think early on I chose to just take some positions against that. So I would watch young trans men come out and people would misgender them and they'd be really angry. They'd be
Yeah.
like, I'm not a woman. And I was like, but there's nothing wrong with being a woman. So maybe shouting that at someone's not super helpful, right?
Yeah.
So I took it a different way where I'd be like, it's super a privilege to be a woman, and lots of women are my friends, and lots of women have taught me and done great things, and I want to be in solidarity with them, and that doesn't take something away from my own experience in terms of having to struggle with being oppressed in certain locations.
Yeah. So did you feel that there was inclusion for you within the broad spectrum of feminism, during your transition and as a trans identified guy?
I think that there was a history, particularly in the years that I was coming out, of that inclusion not being very apparent, and at least in a North American context.
Yeah.
I chose to look at it as we were being pitted against each other, and I wasn't participating.
Yeah.
Which is why I'd always say, I actually use male pronouns, but there's nothing wrong with being a woman.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and so I just chose not to play into it because I think it leads to oppression Olympics, and the people who are causing the oppression get let off the hook, where we should just be helping each other through the different locations. So
Right.
as a trans man, yes, I've got responsibility to women. I don't feel I have responsibility for the history of male patriarchy. I haven't been advantaged by it from the same ways as cisgender men have.
Yeah.
I do think I get some advantages from it now that I'm
Yeah.
quote unquote passing.
Yeah.
And I believe I've got some sense of responsibility towards women,
Yeah.
Particularly when you see the horrors of what still happens in so many of our communities and parts of the world.
Yeah. And in terms of like that, trans people being pitted against feminism, and like you said, feminism being used as a weapon to not include folks, right? How have you resisted that, or how have you been part of transforming that, or how do you see that change?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can work in a community and be around some of the women some of the influences that I've had in my life who are women, and not see the intersectionality make sense. And if I'm going to be, for instance, working in a shelter, which I've worked in for years, if I'm going to be working in a shelter, I need to be taking stances of allying with women.
Yeah.
And then also, holding people accountable to be allies with trans people, and that's a negotiation, and the world becomes safer when we do that. I don't think you can work in really stark places where oppression is so bad and women are being disappeared and murdered, and it's so obvious level of violence people are facing, and not understand that you've got a responsibility to.
Yeah.
And so, again, I think I'm closer to feminism than I've ever been, as long as it's got an analysis of class and race.
And colonization.
Colonization.
Because you're talking about just, missing and murdered women who are mostly Aboriginal women, right?
Yeah.
And sex worker women, which feminism also has been pitted kind of against at times, right? Mm-hmm. So who have been the women, or what have been the lessons from feminism that have really mattered in the community work you're doing, organizing around like shelter and responding to homelessness and the violence of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some women within the Vancouver context, particularly in the downtown east side, who've taken stances. I mean, some of the teachings that you've done. Janice Abbott, who's a CEO of a women's organization, who's housed countless women and taken some strong positions about particularly safety for young women.
Yeah. And for sex working women.
sex working women.
Yeah.
Amelia Ridgway, Leslie Reman. I mean, there's a number of women within this community that have really stood up and said no more. And also women who were experiential, who now work for the organization that I work for, that also pulled themselves out of situations that were so often generational and very complex in order to give back and protect other women. So those would be my heroes.
Amelia Ridgway, and
Leslie Reman.
Leslie Reman, we were saying those names pretty quick. So I remember Leslie as being one of the women who brought harm reduction into the shelters. Mm-hmm. And when we were talking with her about that, she said that she did it because she had to listen to women, because these were her sisters who were doing sex work on the street, right? Mm-hmm. And that they told her, how dare you deny us shelter when we're high? Mm-hmm. You need to be the stuff people call low barrier. You have to, because when we're most at risk is when we're using, right? And I just think about those, that's feminism. Mm-hmm. Listening to women, being led by women, right? And just the influence Leslie had on all of us. And I'm just thinking about those conversations with Leslie and Amelia, and what kind of other teachings that they brought to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is you can get a job and start working within community context, and you can forget that there's a history to it that you've just joined in, right? So I think it's, you do a bunch of things, and you take a bunch of action because you see something in the moment, whether it's just, starting LGBTQ2S youth housing programs or whatever that is.
Right.
But you only get to do it on the backs of the things that have already happened.
Right.
So I think that's, and right now we're in an opioid crisis. And it's really risky times, and we're so lucky in Vancouver that often these women were pushing for harm reduction strategies. Or marginalized trans women were demanding better treatment. And so we were set up in a way to respond to an opioid crisis that many cities were not. And again, that's on the backs of a lot of super marginalized folks.
So in terms of like narrative therapy and community work, the stuff that you did, because I know you did your master's at the Dulwich Center in that, how do you see feminism, however broadly you take that, as informing the work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a number of things, and I think that there's this sort of academic view of feminism, and that can be interesting to learn about. And I learned about that a little bit later in life, and but I think I think about the Dulwich Center and doing my master's degree. It was the Aboriginal women that I met there. It was just like, wow, like you've got an immensely interesting and challenging views, but also challenging things in your communities, and you're so hopeful and strong. And so there's the non-academic piece of it that I think we need to be constantly reminded about, that sometimes feminism might not smell like feminism, but it's sure enacted within community context.
Nice.
Feminism.
I remember you and I publishing an article and being asked about referencing some stuff to queer theory, basically, and you saying, no, I'm not referencing everything that my friends and I invented on the streets away to the academy, right? And then thinking about what happens with feminism as well, right? That it belongs to certain people who get to publish it and say it in certain spaces, but we see it enacted across like genders, right? But on the backs of which women? Right?
I mean, I see a feminism in my job as this peer worker who is experiential, who works for us, and her getting someone to the hospital, getting a woman to the hospital, so she gets treatment, and sitting there beside her because she knows as another Indigenous woman that woman's not going to be treated well. Like that's feminism in action. I mean, I think often when we have these kinds of conversations, we can forget that.
And that so much moves forward on the backs of oppressed folks in those multiple locations, right?
And it's more desirable to get on board with. Like if I'd been that young girl in that suburban context, I bet you I could have seen that and been like, that's pretty cool.
So feminism didn't call to you when you were young. Like you said, it was elitist. Right? So there were pieces that were missing that weren't like calling you. But you actually think it might have helped you be safer in the world.
For sure.
No, that's kind of cool. Do you have any ideas about where you think any of the work that you are engaged in is going to go in terms of feminism or contributing to feminism? I'm thinking about your location as a trans guy, and thinking about a lot of people talk about feminism needing to expand to be inclusive of trans folks, and inclusion's such a low bar. What you're thinking about that?
I mean, feminism essentially is just equal rights for all genders and all sexes, really, if we were to expand it. So that sounds like a pretty good deal. I think to me it's hard to argue with, right? But but I do think it has to have a class and race analysis. And then it became more interesting to me when it was just a flat argument. And I think often movements get flattened on purpose by political dissidents. Like the right-wing movements want to, they create terms like politically correct in order to squash movements. And so I think that whether or not we're identifying as feminists, or we're really interested in class struggle at that moment, or we're interested in race struggle, whatever that is, we have to be on guard that they don't get flattened and become uninteresting to young people, right?
Which is the backlash, right? Which is the truth of feminism. Speak truth to power, you will get kicked in the teeth, right? No, it's cool. Anything else you're bubbling around in your noodle on this?
I think my noodle's empty.
Okay, good. Well, thanks so much for talking to me about this. And thanks, Cheryl, thanks so much for inviting us to have another conversation about stuff.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks.